Our first speaker today is Elliott West, who will speak on the great coincidence, the California Gold Rush and the Remaking of America. Professor West has written 7 books, including The Last Indian War, The Nez Perce Story, which is one of his 3 books to receive the Wrangler Award from our own National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, and it's one of his 2 books to win the Western History Association's first prize, both given to the year's outstanding work in Western history, and so he has won it not once but twice. His book, The Contested Plains, received 6 national awards, including the Penn West Award as the year's best nonfiction book and the Francis Parkman Prize as the outstanding book in American history. In addition, he is the author of more than 75 journal articles and chapters. He teaches at the University of Arkansas, where he is Alumni Distinguished Professor of History. And he has twice at the University of Arkansas received from the students the Teacher of the Year Award. In 1995, he was named the state's Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. We're very glad that he has come across the border to be here with us today. Please welcome Professor Elliott West.
Well, thank you, President Boren. Thanks to all of you for coming this morning, and thanks certainly to the University of Oklahoma for inviting me here and for sponsoring this wonderful event, this teach-in. I understand this is the 4th one. It's a great idea, terrific idea for all the reasons that President Boren said. I especially appreciate dedicating this year's teach-in to the American frontier and the American West, because among other things, I think that our part of the country, the American West, has yet to receive its true recognition for its full role in the history of this country, and I would like to think that this sort of an event can contribute to that. And it's in that spirit that I chose the topic that I did this morning that I call the Great Coincidence. So what was that? What was the Great Coincidence? Well, January 24th, 1848, about 7 o'clock in the morning, James Marshall, who was a New Jersey carpenter who was in charge of building a mill on the American River in Northern California, was out walking along the bed of that river. He had built a temporary dam, and then had it blasted so this water would flush down through the river to dig out this area to speed up the process of building the mill. And he looked down, and he saw something sparkling, and he picked it up. It was, of course, gold. 7 o'clock in the morning, January 24th, 1848. Sometime in the afternoon, early afternoon, on February the 2nd, 1848, in a suburb of Mexico City, the suburb of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the American emissary, Nicholas Trist, and representatives of the temporary Mexican government initialed a treaty that would give to the United States what we call the Mexican Cession. It's roughly the southwestern 1/4 of what's today the United States, including, of course, California. So the great coincidence is just this. Within roughly 200 hours, the United States acquired California, and California began to be revealed as the richest place on the planet Earth. How rich are we talking about? Someone figured out once that the fleck of gold that Marshall picked up was worth about half a dollar, worth about 50 cents. 1852, 4 years later, California in that year produced $65 million worth of gold. By 1900, California had produced roughly $1,400 million worth of gold. And that's 19th century billion, when billion meant something. To put that in global context, in the context of the world at that time and in the world historically, more gold was produced in California in 5 years, between 1850 and 1855, that had been produced in the entire world over the previous 356 years, from the time of Columbus until 1848, until that discovery. More gold was produced in California alone in 1852 than had been produced in the entire world throughout the 18th century. Incredible. To put that in a little more specific, tangible context, eventually a mint was established in San Francisco. And in 1856, someone noticed that so much gold was being processed in the San Francisco Mint in 1856 that the furnaces couldn't handle it, and some of the gold was being blown out of the smokestacks in the mint. And so they sent people for a quarter mile around this mint to sweep up the roofs of the buildings, gilded roofs in San Francisco because of all of this. It's astonishing. And it happened here. Which raises the question, what did this mean? Surely the impact of this must have been enormous for this country and for the world. And of course the impact was truly global of all of this. But what did it mean for us? What did this mean for the United States? What did it mean for us as Westerners? What can we learn from this? What questions does this raise? What new ways can this help us think about the history of this country and the emergence, the transformation of this country in the 19th century? That's what I'd like to talk about this morning, and to suggest three ways. Now, there are many consequences of this great coincidence, but three in particular it seems to me worth paying attention to. Number one, what this did was create essentially overnight, in historical terms, on the far side of this newly expanded nation, what I think of as a kind of a counterweight to the society in the East. Suddenly, within a few years, there was this large and rapidly growing population on the Pacific coast, and at least as important in that, this large and vigorous and extraordinarily sophisticated economy on the far side of this new nation. What did that mean? What was the impact of that? I think the impact was huge for the development of this country, across the country, from coast to coast. Consider three facts. First, the one that I've already mentioned, that California produced this astonishing amount of money very, very quickly, more wealth than had been produced anywhere on Earth in one place at one time. And this, of course, as we all know, triggered this swarming of people out to the Pacific coast, this very rapid growth of population. Tens of thousands and then eventually hundreds of thousands of people came to California from literally across the globe. You can go in the census and find people from Iceland and Greenland mining gold in California. 100,000 people, the census tells us, in 1850. Nearly 400,000 people 10 years later in 1860. Well, we all know about that. A lot of money real fast, a lot of people real fast. What I think we don't pay enough attention to is the isolation of California, nationally speaking. California, the mother lode, was as far as you could get from the usual sources of authority and power and supply and support in this country. If President James Polk in 1850 had been given a map of the new United States, the one stretching all the way to the Pacific coast, and had been asked to put his finger on the place in this new nation that was farthest, as far as you could possibly go in the United States, and still be in the United States, his finger would be on what was now the richest place in the world. So these three things together, the money, the large population, and the isolation, created very quickly this remarkably sophisticated economy on the far coast, because it had to. All of these people, they all needed to be fed, they all needed to be housed, they all needed all of the things that an economy is supposed to do. And while they could, of course, things did come in by sea from the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, those worlds. Essentially, California had to do most of it itself. In a sense, California had to become its own mother country. Think of it that way. And it had to do it very quickly. But that's okay, because they had the money to do it. And not only that, because they were building this economy virtually from scratch, this economy was, from the very beginning, remarkably advanced, sophisticated. It was as if California was born modern, and really has never been anything else since then. What are some of the implications? What specifically did this mean? Well, look at the aspect of the economy that had been the backbone of the American economy from the very beginning: farming, agriculture. In 1850, there were roughly 900 farms in California. In 1860, 10 years later, 19,000 farms. The improved land in California increased from about 30,000 acres in 1850 to about 2,500,000 acres in 1860. That figures out to, my calculator tells me, about an 8,200% increase in improved land, but who's counting? This agriculture produced this astonishing variety of goods, the basics, grain, as we'll see in a moment, potatoes, all the fundamentals of to feed people. Fruit, of course. There was already a kind of a fruit industry, but it's exploded in size. Grapevines for wine, all kinds of garden crops. It produced also this astonishing boosterism among the Californians. There's a agricultural compendium published in around 1860 that claims that Californians had produced a 210-pound squash, a 10-pound carrot, a beet 5 feet long, and a tomato 2 feet around. Now, these are not Texans speaking here. These are Californians. True or not, the fact is that they were producing a lot of food for a lot of people very quickly, and they were they were doing it remarkably efficiently, which leads to the second point. The production of some of this food, especially some of it, was along the most advanced lines of that time. Grain is the best example here. California's grain industry, producing wheat in the Central Valley, was, as I said, born modern. From the very outset, it was cultivated at the time the rest of the country was modernizing, was transitioning toward this modern style of agriculture. California didn't have to retool. California just tooled. They just did it from the start. Large areas of land rather than smaller farms, with the most advanced machinery that was available at that time: headers and harvesters, gang labor, most of it migrant labor, California Indians and Hispanics. All of this operating with this remarkable economy of scale, producing huge amounts of grain very, very quickly. In 1850, the grain production of California was really yet to get underway. It was virtually nil. 1860, California produced 6 million bushels of wheat in 1 year, 10 years later. This very quickly satisfied the local market, and they began exporting. So by the middle of the 1850s, California was emerging as one of the major grain exporters of the United States. And by 1865, 1 out of every 3 bushels of grain being exported from the United States was leaving from San Francisco. It was being sent all around the Pacific Rim, and amazingly, its main market by 1860 was England. 60% of all this wheat, this enormous flow of wheat leaving California, was going to Liverpool and going to Plymouth, going to London. This was 14,000 nautical miles from San Francisco. But by 1860, most of the bread being eaten by citizens of Liverpool was made from wheat that was being produced in Central California. Same thing was happening in manufacturing. California had to supply its own manufacturing needs very quickly in the same way that it did its agriculture. Who's going to process that wheat into flour? Well, they needed flour mills, so they built them. all of those towns that are being built, all of the wood, all of the sluices that are being built, all of the mines, eventually the timbers for the mines underground that eventually had to be built, all of that had to come locally, which means we need lumber mills, and they built them. But also industry for all kinds of things, including mining production. Underground mining especially, and certain types of surface mining require enormous pieces of machinery. Who's going to build them? Can you really import them? Not really. So they had to be built locally, and they were built in San Francisco, south of Market Street on San Francisco. This large manufacturing enterprise was constructed, and this was something, especially, of course, after 10 years after the discovery of Marshall's discovery, silver was discovered just across the Sierra in what became known as the Comstock Lode. Which was all underground mining, which required this enormous amount of machinery and the stamp mills on top to crush the quartz. So California, San Francisco began producing amalgamation pans and stamps for the stamp mills and all of the other things that they needed, stuff for pumps for the water. There was a pump in the Comstock that required a flywheel that was 40 feet in diameter and weighed 220,000 pounds. It was made in San Francisco. But, of course, all other kinds of consumer goods being produced there as well. Most famously, work pants from the company of Levi Strauss. But much more than that, glassware and shoes, turpentine, ground coffee, Folgers coffee originated in San Francisco, brooms, matches, pianos, just about everything you could imagine that people were consuming on the Pacific coast. All sorts of smaller machinery. In Placerville, California, there was a man who made wheelbarrows. His name was Wheelbarrow Johnny, they called him. And he made a good bit of money in wheelbarrows, and he took that money, $8,000, and went back to his family in Indiana and started a wagon company. His name was John Studebaker. So, what was the first implication? The first implication of the great coincidence? Well, what did it mean? Overnight, the United States became a truly bi-coastal, a truly continental economy, with developed, sophisticated economies on both coasts that then, of course, began to spread toward the center. So the development of this country, the conquest of the United States, of the interior West, and the development of the interior West really happens in both directions, sort of coming together like the sides of a vice. It could not possibly have happened the way it did, as fast as it did, if that had not happened, if James Marshall had not looked down on that January morning in 1848. But all this came as a cost. The second implication of the great coincidence had to do with native peoples. California, of course, was not an empty place that was waiting to be developed. It was far from it. California in 1848 had the largest and the densest population of native peoples, indigenous peoples, anywhere in the United States, by far. The numbers, the population of Indian peoples is a matter of great debate, and right now, in fact, it's a matter of a pretty vigorous debate. And all sorts of, several historians and scholars are working on that question, but it's, without question, it's large. And looking back on it in this context, I think the point to make is this large population, this dense population of Indian peoples was extremely vulnerable. Vulnerable in a couple of ways. First, it was divided into many dozens of different tribes and subgroups, and those were in turn divided into small rancherias, small villages. So there was no unified presence of Indian peoples in California. And vulnerable, secondly, because these people, all of them really, lived by an economy of hunting and gathering and fishing, which is quite an efficient economy if you're able to do it the way you need to do it. But a hunting and gathering and fishing economy requires that people be at the right place at exactly the right time. just at that place, when the fruits, when the plants are maturing, just at that place when the salmon are running, just at that place when the migration of elk and deer are crossing at this particular place. You've got to know the country very, very well, and you've got to use it in this very precise, choreographed way. It's like a great dance. That means it's vulnerable, however, to change. And if there's one thing you can say about the California gold rush, it changed things. There was this onslaught, this juggernaut of change that came with these tens of thousands of people who flooded into this Indian country. To begin with the obvious, they very quickly hunted out all of the game. They began to strip the country of its trees in order to build this new infrastructure. That led to erosion, which polluted the streams, and they were using mercury, for example, to process the ore. And there were this astonishing amount of mercury that was being put into the streams, killing the fish and poisoning the fish that were already there. In other words, the first impact of this on Indian peoples was to destroy, to simply cut the legs out from under their basic ways of living. So they're unable to feed themselves, and they responded as you would expect them to. That is, they turned to what was available. It is, if you take away all the deer, you start hunting other game, like cattle. You start killing the cattle and stealing the cattle, which led, of course, to reprisals and all sorts of conflicts. Secondly, in this economy, there was this crying need for labor, for work. Yeah, there were the Indians. And so many of these Indians, thousands of these Indians, were pressed into, in effect, de facto slavery or indentured servitude. There was this infamous law of 1850 that provided for the arrest of Indians for, quote, and I'm quoting here, for loitering or strolling about. Yeah, what does that mean? It means, of course, in the terms of Indian life, that means doing what they're supposed to be doing, what they mean to move around, or simply not to be employed. It's like a vagrancy law. They would be arrested, and anyone who would pay their bond would have them as a indentured worker. So there were tens of thousands of Indians who were in effect enslaved to do the work of this new economy. These Indians were enslaved in ways in which, in effect, broke apart the families. The women were put to work as domestics, or in some cases as prostitutes. The men were put together as workers in the mines, separating, sort of breaking apart the family itself. There was this vigorous trade in the sale of children. You can read the newspapers in California. You can see that there were Indian children for sale, $50 to $100 each, to work as domestics or simply to sort of keep around as sort of pets. The effect of this was that the essential cell of Indian society, and of any society, of course, the family, was destroyed. And so in much of Indian California, the birth rate dropped to virtually zero. And finally, this is one of the rare cases in American history when there were actual cases, documented cases of Indian killing expeditions, of groups of Californians organized, in some cases financed locally and indirectly by the state, to go out and destroy the Indians in the most basic way, physically, to kill them off. So, what's the second implication of this great coincidence? Well, it triggered what I think has to be ranked as the greatest calamity for Native peoples in all of the history of this country, of the United States. It certainly must be one of the great blots. One of the great blots on our history. As I said, the claims of the number of Indians involved here are debatable. But even if we accept the lowest number of Indians who were, the rate in which the Indian population dropped during these years, even if we accept the most conservative numbers, this was worse than anything that has ever happened anywhere in the country, in this nation's history, from the time of the Revolution up until into the 20th century. If the higher estimates are anything close to accurate, then it really comes down to this. The number of Indians, the number by which the Indian population in California alone dropped in these years before the Civil War, up through the Civil War, would be equal to all Indians living after the Civil War in Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Colorado, Kansas, Arizona, and New Mexico. That's the period, of course, when we normally think of the great Indian wars after the Civil War, the Great Plains and in the Southwest. But think of those Indian wars, and think of those wars, think if those wars destroyed every Indian alive at that time. That would be roughly the number in which some scholars say died or disappeared in California during those years. So the second implication is distinctly tragic, and it reminds us of the tragedy that happened in so much of the American West and frontier during these years. Third implication, this great coincidence turned the United States, turned this expanded nation, increasingly into the world of the Pacific and toward Asia. I'm tempted, and therefore will give in to the temptation, to call this a new orientation of the United States. This westward expansion turned us toward the far, far, far west, a west that was so far west that it was the far east. Again, the timing is critical here. But what we know now is some very, very interesting work that's come about in the last 10 years or so, is that the period from the 1820s up until 1848, until this discovery of gold, was one in which the United States and the nations of the Atlantic world generally were increasingly turning their attention to the Pacific world. This traditional place of influence on our culture was moving increasingly during these years before the gold rush into this far place around the Pacific world, and what the historian David Igler calls the Great Ocean of the Pacific coast. There was exploration, of course, and mapping that would continue in the years after this. Very vigorous trade in the hides of certain animals, the sea otters and other seals of the Pacific coast, of the cattle of California, the hides of cattle, and tallow from the hooves and the horns of California cattle. A very vigorous trade in all things of guano. I won't go into the details of what that is, but it's very important as a fertilizer, and becomes a major enterprise during these years of the early 19th century. A very vigorous trade in human beings, slave trade of these incredibly diverse populations around the Pacific Rim. So there were hundreds of ships plying from the Atlantic coast, from the Atlantic world, and from the United States Atlantic coast, plying their trade throughout the Pacific world during these years leading up to the gold rush. Honolulu, Hawaii, and Honolulu in particular. Honolulu was emerging as one of the busiest ports on Earth during these years. There's a great exchange of peoples, Hawaiians in particular. Hawaii, of course, being centrally located out there in the middle of all of this action. The Hawaiians moving around the Pacific Rim, and especially to the American Pacific coast. They were called Kanakas, and there were thousands of them manning these ships, sailing around the Pacific, and they're working in other ways. If any of you from Idaho, or have ever been to Idaho, southern Idaho, there's a beautiful river called the Owyhee River, Owhyhee, the Owyhee. The Owyhee River is just a variation of Hawaii, because they were Hawaiian fur traders out there in the interior of the Pacific Northwest, working along the Columbia River. A community of them, a large community of hundreds of Hawaiians living up in what is today Oregon and Washington. So that was all on the eve. That was all up to the coming of the great coincidence. So you can imagine then what happens suddenly when this is the busiest place on Earth, the most desirable place on Earth. California immediately plugs itself, and after that plugs the United States into this new world out there of the Pacific. This trade and this action is enormous, is immediately and enormously invigorated. You know, when miners, all of these men from Indiana and Pennsylvania and Missouri go out to the Pacific Coast. Of course, they're almost all of them leaving their families behind, and so they're forced to do all kinds of work that they have no idea how to do, cooking and so forth, including washing their clothes. And if they had enough money, miners in California would send their clothes to the laundry. The laundry was in Honolulu. These people would send their, and they would, be weeks before they got it back, but rather than actually do the work of washing their clothes, they would send it to Hawaii to get back. Well, the first impact of this, of course, because there was such a need, all of this huge inflooding of imports from around the Pacific Rim, all sorts of food from the South American Pacific coast, from Chile and Peru, potatoes and wheat and fruit. All sorts of other imports from around the rim, including Australia. It was far faster to travel between Australia and California than it was to travel between California and the Atlantic coast. So they brought in from California. They brought in potatoes, and they brought in bricks, horses. They brought in blankets from Australia made out of kangaroo hides to be sold in the diggings of California. But very quickly, for reasons that I hope I got across with the first part of this talk, very quickly California begins to provide for itself, and then it begins to export, just as it did that grain. The grain is sent out also all around the Pacific Rim, but they're producing and exporting much more than that. Timber, for example. The great forests of Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, redwood in particular. Redwood becomes a major commodity circulating all around the Pacific Rim. Taiwan had been closed to all outside trade for 200 years until 1854, when a businessman from Oregon, Nathaniel Crosby, persuaded the leaders of Taiwan to begin to import redwood. And soon it was being sold across all around the Pacific, including in Australia and in Tasmania. A huge surge of freight around the Pacific. Hong Kong, the number of ships docking in Hong Kong over a little more than 12 years increased 10 times over during these years because of all of this. All of this, of course, triggered by that discovery of James Marshall in January of 1848. So, what does the great coincidence mean here? Well, it really began the process that continues until today, projecting American interest westward into the Pacific world. Who could possibly understand the history of the United States in the 20th century, certainly in the 21st century, without having a grasp of that? When does it start? What starts it? It began earlier, but it's really the gold rush. It's really the discovery of gold that accelerates this and projects all the more powerfully American interests into the far, far west toward the Pacific. So, what can we say about all of this then? I think a couple of things, but they all come down to the fact that by 1860, because of this extraordinary coincidence, which must be the greatest coincidence in American history, by 1860, this nation was really part of a very different world. We were living in a fundamentally different world. We always are, of course, but the changes by 1860, between 1848, 49, and 1860 were huge, enormous, almost impossible to calculate. If you stand in California, look around, what you would see first, I suppose, if you had any sensibility, was the horrific calamity that had befallen the native peoples over a period of just a dozen years by that time. If you were to look west, to the east, I think you would see that California was now beginning to reach out into the interior to transform that world as well. By 1860, there were 33 states in the United States in 1860. By 1860, California ranked 12th in industrial output. In 10 years, it had moved beyond 33, moved beyond more than 20 of American states. Its reach, its market, San Francisco's market, was larger than any market of any American city with the single exception of Chicago by 1860. And what this meant was, of course, that the interior West began to be first conquered, and then developed and occupied and transformed far more rapidly than it would have been before. If we stand in California and look both east and west, we would see that the United States by 1860 had been connected to the rest of the world in ways that it would not have been, I think, for decades if there had not been this discovery of gold. There were Liverpudlians. There were people in Liverpool in England eating bread and biscuits and cake made from the wheat produced in the Central Valley of California. There were people in Tasmania shopping in stores and buildings built of California redwood. There were Honolulu laundrymen washing the shirts and the pants of men who were working on the other side or on the far side of the Pacific in Placerville and Maryville, California. And those miners waiting for their clothes to come back from Honolulu might be going to sleep under blankets made out of kangaroo hides and laying their heads on pillows stuffed with Hawaiian pulu fibers. It was a different world, a connected world. The world, of course, a world that we are far more familiar with today. It was a process that was accelerated enormously then by those events that happened in Northern California. So I think I would end here by saying first that the California Gold Rush and this remarkable pair of events of the discovery of gold and the acquisition of California coming together, within 9 days. This must rank as one of the most significant and consequential events in all of American history. It's not just this colorful paint your wagon kind of a story. It's one that has huge consequences for the years ahead and for the transformation of this country, for the making of the America, the nation that we see today. And the larger point there, I hope, the one that this makes, and I hope will be made by this teach-in today more generally, is that we cannot possibly understand the history of the United States in the 20th and the 21st centuries unless we understand the great transformative power of what was happening in the American West. Surely, we must begin this job of giving the American West and its history its true and due place in the history of this country and of us as a people, including its most tragic dimensions. Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, what fascinating insights, and what a better understanding we have now of our own history. We could take just 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll stay on time. We'll have a short break before we have Patty Limerick here to talk about water in the West, which is a really big topic also. So any questions? Any questions? There are Crimson Club members there with microphones, and they'll bring them to you so you can be heard. Anyone has a question, just raise your hand. Maybe I can hear you from there. What year did the Chinese start being brought in as workers to California?
Can you hear me from this?
I think so.
The question is, when did Chinese start coming in as labor? There were Chinese almost from the outset, 49 to 50, but very, very few. And interestingly, they were welcomed as necessary laborers. That changed in 1852, the same year in which the gold production peaked, for various reasons that have as much to do, of course, with the history of China as with California. The number of Chinese coming into to the Pacific Coast surges in 1852, and it will continue to grow after that. And it's that arrival of Chinese workers who become, of course, economic competitors with native-born miners that begins this other rather tragic and unpleasant aspect of the gold rush, the persecution of Chinese. So it starts it's there from the start, but it really begins vigorously in 1852.
Other questions? Yes, here. I was worrying about that. You know, we all have frustrations about our laundry from time to time. How long did it take?
It took about 3 weeks, 3 weeks minimum. I have this image of this guy in Placerville, you know, getting his shirts back and just said no starch, you know, but
Okay, any other questions? Any questions? Looking around. No, back here. The topic of railroads and the pull or push of California. Yeah.
Well, Richard White's going to be talking later, so it will come up. There was this rapid growth of infrastructure, of transportation in California following this for predictable reasons. It included better roads, the appearance of Wells Fargo, and it's an astonishing story in itself, and also the development of telegraph and railroads in California itself. The question of whether transcontinental railroads were necessary at that time is one that is also a matter of some interest and debate. Professor White, who will speak later, says not at that time, but I think he would agree that there was a need for railroads and improved transportation within California itself, and that happens. It happens a bit later from the time that I'm talking about now. By the 1860s, it's getting underway, but it's sort of a later development, yes.
Thank you. One last question.
The question has to do with the role of California in the Civil War, in particular, the fact that there were a lot of Southerners living in California, especially in Southern California, down around Los Angeles and San Bernardino. The Confederacy had these, I'm convinced, fevered, weird dreams about the possibility of controlling California. I'm in a wonderful and very vigorous exchange with some graduate students and younger faculty right now about this. They argue that there was a real possibility of Southern control of California and the Pacific Coast. I would say there's simply no way, but they certainly hoped for that. They wanted that. There were all kinds of fantasies for it. I frankly cannot see how that possibly could have happened. Now, the population, demographically, California was shifting dramatically during the 1850s. Away from what it had been in 1849 and 1850. At that point, there were a lot of Southerners who had come out there. About the historian who has studied this most closely says about 1/3. As far as I can tell, by 1860, that number had dropped to around 15%. It was dropping very rapidly. Given the military realities of that time, I simply cannot see how the Confederacy would have any real chance of controlling that. Now, the question is more subtle than that. Could some sort of de facto slavery, African-American slavery, have been established there? Maybe so. That's an interesting question. The Southern presence certainly continued there. Again, certainly in Southern California. But California was divided itself along during the Civil War like the rest of the country. And its story really has just begun to be told. 2 very good books in the last 10 years looking at this. And there's some other very good books, 3 actually. And there's very good books that are in the works right now.
Thank you very much. Really, really interesting insights into the impact of California on our history.